All right, welcome back everyone to Jface Games. Today we have an opportunity that is interesting. We get to look at a designer who has changed their mind, or at least audited their primary resolution system, and we get to compare the two to see why they would do that. What were they thinking? What about this new system are they trying to answer that they felt like their first system was not handling? And I think that's pretty interesting. You don't get that opportunity very often. So the designer is John Harper. And John Harper has created, I think what he's most known for is Blades in the Dark, but he's created some other cool games. Aegon's fantastic. Lasers and Feelings was a game that I talked about on here because I think it has such a cool, like very simplistic resolution system and character creation that I think is just brilliant. But he recently came out with this, Blades in the Dark Deep Cut. And I think that Blades in the Dark Deep Cut, it's in essence different systems or different expansions that you can add to the first game, Blades of the Dark. And the most interesting part about it is, in essence, a rehaul of the entire resolution system or the action system. Like, how do you actually perform your actions? So let's take a look at that. First, we got to talk about the old one, right? So some of you might not be aware of the old system, but in essence, what it was a D6 dice pool where you're going to roll your dice pool and you're hoping whatever your highest dice is out of that dice pool, that's your result, okay? You're looking to get a 6. 6 means that you did exactly what you want to do. It's a full success. If you get 2 6s, it's a critical success. If you get a 4 or 5, it's a partial success, and you're going to get some sort of consequence. And then finally, if you get a 1 to 3, you don't have a success at all, and you're just getting a bad outcome, right? So it's just terrible, terrible all around. Now, I think this is interesting to look at. This is in essence, when you're having an action, these are the steps that occur when an action is sort of declared, right? First, the player is going to say what I'm trying to do, what's the intentions. So the DM's laid out the scene. The player says, oh, I'm going to try and do this, and I want to use this action to do that, right? Like let's say I'm trying to swing down from this bridge. The enemy's below me. I'm going to take this rope and I'm going to swing down from up high, and I'm going to try and attack that person as I'm kind of swinging down. And I want to use my finesse, right? And there's different sort of actions or attributes that you're choosing. I'm going to use my finesse because my finesse gives me 2 dice, and I think it's a finesse move. So then steps 3 and 4, this is where the GM has to determine what's the position and what's the effect of this action. And so this was one of those things I loved. I loved the concept of thoroughly, is that position and effect are determining, position is determining what is the risk, in essence, of your decision, and the effect is what's the output of what this decision, if successful, is going to do, right? And these were, in essence, each of these, position had 3 tiers and effect had 3 tiers. So here is the position, right? Position's 3 tiers is it's a controlled situation, or it's a very risky situation, which is risky is sort of your standard in this setting and in these games, or it's a desperate situation. And depending on these, it would alter what that rolling a 4-5 and rolling a 1 through 3 meant, right? The critical was usually roughly the same, right? The 6 was the same. You did it. Because getting a 6 meant you got your effect, which was a different sort of chart. But the 4-5 was either going to be, if it was desperate, it's very serious, versus it's not nearly as serious if it's controlled. So if you do something controlled, you are also sort of mitigating the potential risk on your own character. However, I want it to be noted that if you did desperate things, you skilled up. That was a way of leveling up skills, is that if you even just attempted a desperate roll, that skill was going to potentially improve. So that's determining the position. The effect for the GM is down here. There were 3 different levels of effect. It was great, standard, and limited. And how the book described how you would potentially determine that was you looked at these 3 different sort of like categories. It was, you would think about the situation in terms of what's the potential potency of the situation, what's the quality or tier, like what do you have versus what do they have, and then what's the scale? Are you outnumbered, or there are lots of them, or are you lots of you? Because sometimes these decisions you made was like, I marshaled this group. It was much more, it was not as binary of an action. That was one of my problems when I run the game, is that I still think in, very tactical binary terms, where it's like, I attack with my sword versus like, I make these things happen and I marshal these people and we all do this. There's a little bit more macro of actions that you can have. You can still have micro actions, these sort of like very smaller actions, but these are little bigger actions. So sometimes you took this into account, right? I played mostly Band of Blades, which use the same system, and so they give descriptions of like, you're wading into the zombies, right? So if that's a scenario, they've got you on scale, but maybe you have them on quality, and you've got this massive Gatsu style like two-handed sword, so maybe you've got the potency, right? And so you would weigh these things as a GM to determine, what do I think this outcome is? Do I think they're going to have a very high effect? Yeah, I think they will. Are they standing behind a door, so the numbers of zombies are coming in one at a time, so the zombie scale doesn't really help them? These are the kind of things you have to make a decision on. So once you've got that, then you determine the bonus dice. Bonus dice is, at this point in time, I've only got 2 die because I am rolling with my finesse, and my finesse is 2 die on this swing, right? If someone's helping me, I get an extra +1. I get 3 die. And then I can determine if I want to push myself or if I want to take a devil's bargain, right? Pushing myself was, I get to add another die, and I get to increase the level of effect from, say, standard to great. But I got to take 2 stress. And 2 stress is, stress is your, in essence, hit points, and you don't have a lot of them. It's like 5 stress total. So like taking 2 stress, it's probably more than that, but taking 2 stress was a big deal, right? That was a big deal. But you knew exactly how much stress it was, and you knew what the consequence was. It was like, I'm going to take 2 stress, I'm going to get an extra die, and I get to be a little bit more effective. A devil's bargain was a little different, because a devil's bargain was, you were going to give up something. You could potentially change the scene in some way. You're adding some sort of issue, or you're taking on a particular consequence up front, and you're saying, I want this consequence, and I'm going to get this extra die. And you can only push yourself or get a devil's bargain. But now, maybe I've taken a devil's bargain, or I've pushed myself, I've taken 2 stress, I've got a friend helping me, I've got 4 die, I roll those 4 die, I'm hoping I get a 6 out of those 4. Maybe I get a 4 or 5. I still get my effect, but now there's a consequence coming at me. At this point in time, now the GM has to determine what the consequence was. The GM, this is, in essence, there's 3 or 4 pages on these potential consequences. They give you this kind of insight into, okay, here are the 5 buckets of what a consequence can be. You could, as a consequence, you could reduce their effect, you could give them a complication, you could lose an opportunity, you could do damage to them, etc. You could put them in a worse position for next time. So now what was risky scenario, the next time they do anything, it's desperate, right? And they give descriptions onto what each of these is and how you can maybe use them. But it's up to the GM at this point in time to figure this out, right? They've got to figure out, oh, now what kind of consequence do I want for that individual? And let me also mark off their effect, like how much damage they did. If the player takes a consequence, they can potentially make a resist roll. And this is sort of a gamble, right? Because the resist roll, what it is that you have these 3, in essence, attributes that you're going to, they're going to be different degrees, and the GM is going to determine which one of these is, in essence, you're going to have to roll for. Oh, this is a prowess roll. And you roll as many dice as you have, right, for that, because once again, it's a dice pool. And depending on what you roll, depends on how much stress you have. So you're going to successfully not take the consequence, but the question is, how much stress do you take in the process? If you get a 6 on that that dice pool, if you roll a 6, you don't take any, right? But then each number you roll less than 6, you're taking the difference, right? So if I roll a 2, I just took 4 stress. That's a lot of stress, right? So it's a risk. It's a risk reward in terms of this resist, but I'm not going to get the consequence. Now, so that's in essence the original resolution mechanic. It is a, it's supposed to drive that narrative of what I want to do first. Then, after that, after I've decided what I'm doing, I understand what the risk reward is because the GM now tells me what the risk reward is. I then say, oh, okay, that's the risk reward. Let me pool in more dice potentially to help me with it. I then potentially fail, or something happens, and then I try to resist whatever happened that was bad, and then we move on, right? That's sort of what's happening there. So it's this idea of try to let the players come up with their narrative, and then the GM has to determine what that narrative means mechanically. And now the players have a decision to make in order to stress themselves or whatever, in order to mitigate the mechanical, situation, right? Now, I think in play, there's probably a lot of shared discussion about the position effect, right? There's probably a little bit more shared storytelling in this game than other games, where you're saying, oh yeah, I bet that's desperate, or I was hoping for that to be desperate, technically, GM, because I wanted to, get better at this skill, so I don't mind if it's desperate. Oh, okay, maybe this will make it desperate. So there's probably a little bit of that conversation. What do they do in the new system? Well, the new system, now, this is looking at a little bit of a difference, right? First off, they call it a threat roll now. And the threat roll, there's supposed to be, and this is from direct quote from it, is there's supposed to be an emphasis more on how to avoid danger rather than focusing on success or failure. So whereas the other game, you were, like I said, I listed that out. The avoiding danger was at the very end. It was at the very end, I then decide, oh, I guess I want to try and make a resist roll, even though it might hurt me, right? Now it's like, it seems like we're taking that concept and we're pushing that idea more forward. We're bringing that more forward in the decision of my action, almost, right? Consequences are up front. So whereas before, the player told you what they're going to do, and then you figured out what the heck that meant and what potential consequences were after the roll. They roll, and then you say, oh, okay, you just failed. Ooh, this is desperate. This is now going to happen. So if I want to be able to emphasize avoiding danger, that means the GM, I need to know what the consequences are before I actually do something, right? That risk reward is established a little bit more up front. It's supposed to be. You get bonus die from suggesting additional threats. This is where it gets really interesting, and I want to go into the mechanics more before we talk about these other ones. So now we have the same action roll, right? But it's tweaked a little bit. You have a D6 is a success, excellent. A 4 or 5 is a reduced consequence, right? And then a 1 to 3 is a consequence. So there's no longer controlled, risky, and desperate in terms of position. They kind of say in the game that just default is risky. Just consider risky as your default. They still have a desperate role in the game, but it's different in terms of what the dice means. So now, almost every time you're rolling, it's considered risky, right? Where it's 6 is success, 4 or 5 is whatever the threat that was determined before is now reduced, and 1 to 3, the threat is going to be full, okay? The other idea is that the effect is automatically standard. So, and not only is the effect automatically standard, but you'll notice that none of these say you have your full effect, you don't do effect. What they say is you avoid threat, you reduce the threat, you take the full threat. Your effect, it's happening. So now it's not a question of let's go back to that guy swinging. I'm jumping off this bridge, I'm swinging down, I'm going to try and hit this dude. In the first scenario, we determine it's desperate and we determine its standard effect or whatever, but I miss and I roll a 1 to 3. So now I just get punched in the face and I fall off and I maybe break my back and I didn't do anything to the guy. In this scenario, it's like, oh, you're going to hit him. You're going to hit him and you're going to do something. It's a question of what happens to you. So you're a little bit more empowered, right? Because you're making things happen. So it's just a matter of what happens to you. Now, what's interesting is this idea of adding additional threats, okay? So now what happens is I've got this dice pool, and let's go back to the scenario. It's me. I'm using my finesse. I've got 2d6. Now what happens is I say, look, I want to try and swing down and hit this guy. And he's like, well, here's the deal. You have a threat, and the GM can add as many threats as they want, technically, right? The threats are that this guy's going to smash you in the face with his hammer, and the other threat is that this rope is going to break, right? Like those are your two threats from this, because you're grabbing this is not your rope, this is a random skinny fraying rope, And so those are your two threats, right? And they might say, this is this guy hitting you as you're swinging into him. I mean, this is like a batter up sort of scenario. So that's like a major threat. And I forget the words they use, but we'll figure it out. But that's like a major threat. The rope breaking, minor threat, because maybe it breaks and then you snap and it snaps and you just kind of land next to him, right? But you're like, oh, I want to keep swinging. I'm gonna fly by this guy. So now I pick up my dice pool, and let's say I only have 2d6. I'm trying to roll those dice to avoid threats, and I have to assign the dice to different threats. So I say, okay, well, I'm going to, in that scenario, say I roll a 6 and a 5, that means that I put the 6 on the getting punched in the face, the major threat. I avoid that one. And I put the 5 on the rope snapping. So now it doesn't fully snap, but maybe it frays, and instead of me being able to swing past him, it doesn't break, but now I'm like swinging and I'm penduluming, right? I'm near him, right? That might be the outcome. But the cool thing is that they now have this opportunity to add additional threats. So the GM has told you, you've got these two threats. And you say, well, in essence, the reason you as a player want to add additional threats is because you want more dice. Because you're thinking, holy crap, I got to roll a 6 on 2 dice not to get smashed by this guy's hammer as I'm swinging towards him. So what other threats could I have? What if in this swinging process I drop I've got the bag that has the MacGuffin on it, right? So whatever the MacGuffin is in this scenario, I've got the MacGuffin, it's on my strap. What if there's a chance it falls out of the bag? And the GM goes, ooh, that's a good one. And so now you've added this other threat. It gives you another dice. Because by adding a threat as a player, you get another dice. So now I get 3d6. So my chances of getting a 6 is higher, so I can avoid getting smashed in the face by the bad guy. But I now have more. The chances of one of these threats happening is also increased, right? So now maybe now the scenario is I swing down, I get a 6, I get 2 6s. So I get out of the way of the guy's hit. The rope still is fine. I go swinging by, but the MacGuffin falls out and goes into the river. It's like, oh, God. So now, but that's interesting, right? What does pushing yourself look like? So now pushing yourself, they in essence took the reaction roll or the resistance roll, and they took pushing and they smashed them together a little bit. Because now that whole reaction or that whole resistance concept is sort of pushed forward, and it's a part of the narration. Like it's a part of the I'm trying to avoid something right off the bat. So they kind of combine those concepts. Whenever you suffer consequence, you can choose to push yourself to avoid or reduce it. When you do so it's still happening at the back end. You roll the attribute that corresponds to the type of consequence you're suffering. So once again, I would roll my insight, prowess, or resolve, right? But now that's not it's instead of a push was automatically 2 stress, and instead of a reaction, which could be like 0 to 6 stress, now it's still variable, which makes it so it's like, ooh, I hope I don't get 2 stress, or I hope I don't get 1 stress. It's still variable. I hope I don't get 3 stress, I should say. But you don't know what it's going to be, but it's a smaller margin, right? So you might still be able to avoid that threat or reduce that threat in some way, but you're just going to take stress in the process. Now, do they have controlled situations and do they have desperate positions? Absolutely. What they do with this is that a controlled one is pretty much, it's like you don't do the threat roll. If it's a controlled situation and they're trying to focus more on your hero is capable, they're not failing at a lot of things, then it's like just keep going, right? You get through it. And they give some options for what would happen if they give more to that controlled situation. There still could be decisions, but for the most part, it's like maybe you just don't need to roll a threat roll. A desperate situation is awful. In a desperate situation, pretty much a 6 is your only success, and a 5 or less, the whole threat happens. So if it's a desperate situation, then all of those threats I mentioned before are all going to happen unless I roll 6s for all of them, which is pretty brutal, right? Finally, not finally, but there's a couple other things here. A threat roll usually just resolves the consequence of a threat. It doesn't bear on the effect of your scoundrel's own action. This is the idea. This is the idea that yes, failure can happen still. So depending on the scenario, you still, as a GM, could say there is a fail state to this one, right? Like for the most part, you're trying to empower the players and make them feel like they can do epic things and they're just avoiding threat. But occasionally you're like, all right, you're trying to throw this coin from across the room and it goes into the slot of the whatever, and then something happens. It's like, there's a chance you're going to fail this, right? That's incredibly epic and hard to do, right? Now, what I love here is he finally gives a table of effects and consequences. Whereas before, the GM had to determine the complications after the fact, right? So there was this, oh, he just failed, and I said there was I said they were in a risky situation. Now let me figure out what happened, and I've got to determine what that means. Whereas now you're saying, look, right off the bat, you're saying there is a great threat of you getting smashed by this guy as you swing down. Automatically, a great threat means that means you're taking 3 harm, right? You're going to take 3 harm if this fails, right? Or you're in a great position. That means you're going to get 3 ticks on the clocks, the 3 ticks towards success, right? But then there's all these cool descriptors down here for what these means, what these different limited, standard, great, or extreme consequences effects mean, right? Some really cool little descriptors to help you determine how to kind of come up with those, right? I love that. And then finally, there's this Devil's Bargain. So I got to give a shout out. This is Knights of the Last Call, and this is the YouTube video I watched on the deep cuts, and he was describing this Devil's Bargain now as what he describes as a GM move, right? You're trying to move forward in the narrative, and you want things to kind of happen, and so it's much more of you pay a cost to skip past the trouble of this sort of situation. You don't go into a full threat roll. It's like, oh yeah, you can do that. I think some of the examples in it was like, oh, you can pry the window open and sneak in. That's simple enough, but there's going to be some noise, so you're going to tick the alert clock, right? So there's a cost to what you want. You can do it. There's a cost. So the player just has to make a quick decision of, yeah, I'll take it. I'll take the effect. That's fine, right? So it's a very quick. We're not going to go through this whole skill check, threat check. We're just going to quickly, roll this out. Now, some people in the chat, because he was doing a live chat about this, and there were people in there that were describing, they think this is going to take longer, right? They think this second one, this new action system is going to take longer to resolve. I don't know. I haven't played enough. They've probably played a ton, so maybe some of it's just familiarity. If you're very familiar with this system, then it's easier to run. But what are my thoughts on it? And what do I think we're taking away from this in terms of what John Harper wanted? I think that John Harper, it feels like he loved this resistance role so much, or that maybe this portion of his games was the fun part, where it was after the player understood what the consequence was, they were now having to make decisions, that he was just pushing that forward. I wouldn't also be surprised if there was a lot of difficulty for newer GMs to run this system because of the heavy weight of step 3, 4, and then finally what's the actual consequence, right? The step 7, I would say, like what happens, or step 6, the judge the result. That was tough. I'll tell you, when I ran the system, that was very tough especially you're trying to make this really cool narrative game, and then after the player does something and they're doing something wild, and you go, oh God, what does that mean? Like, what's going to happen to them? And it was hard. It was hard to make those complications. And so now it feels like you're putting these threats forward at the beginning, and you can probably talk about them with the players. And I absolutely love this idea of a player adding threats in order to mitigate the risk of the worst threat, but they're now piling on more threats. I think that's the coolest thing out of here, right? where I love that idea of, and this follows suit with the video I put out recently about how we're eliminating role skill checks, right? It's almost like there's a little bit less of a skill. This is definitely not a skill check, right? You're succeeding. You're getting what you want. You're going to do the thing. It's not a skill check. It's a how badly did things happen to you in order for you to get your success, right? I think that's really cool. That was one of the things that I loved about Quest when I played a one-shot with that, is the framing of their with consequence was difficult choice, I think. And to me, I've talked about this before, where when there's a with consequence, I'm always like, oh, whatever it is about the phrasing with consequence, my brain starts to shut down a little bit because I have to figure out what the hell that means. But in that game, all it said was tough choice. And so now it made sense to me to say, oh, you can still hit, you can either, in that game, I would say, you can either miss on your attack, or you can hit them, but they're also hitting you back, right? Like that kind of thing. And it puts the narrative decision of, you know, what happens to your character a little bit more on the player. They have that risk. They have a little bit more of that risk reward that they get to control some. And I think this does that in another way that's really interesting. So I'm pretty excited to try this out at some point in time. This also has, once again, you can get assistance from an ally. I think it changes it differently, but it's the idea of I need to build up a dice pool, and maybe in order to do that, I need to build up more threats. And I think that you can actually, when it comes to additional threats, I don't think there's a limit to additional threats. And they really talked about how it can be fun for other players at the table to throw out threats as well. Like, hey, maybe this is also happening to you. So who knows? Maybe you add like 5 minor... I don't know if that's possible. But maybe you add like 3 more minor threats, and you're like, oh, I just need dice. I just need dice because I'm almost dead, and this dude is about to take my head off. I need dice. And so you're getting all these dice together. So I think it's really interesting. I would be very interested to see how much this slows down the game. But it's really cool to see someone, a designer, take their initial design and play it enough or think about it enough and then decide, you know what, this is what I want this design to do more, potentially. I might be putting words in his mouth. He might just be throwing this out there as I love my first design, but this is interesting. So it'd be interesting I'd love to hear from him at some point in time and see if he felt this is the true design. This is where he wanted it to be in terms of feel and vibe, because I love it. I think it's a really cool idea. So anyways, check out, I had a past video on Blades in the Dark. I had a past video on Band of Blades. So if you like the Forged in the Dark system, you can probably check those out because those games did some wonderful things. I still need to do Scum and Villainy at some point in time. I haven't cracked that book enough at home, but hope you guys are having a good one.